Welcome to the Pearson Centre Conference on the New Challenges for the Canada We Want. The special session is an official opening of the conference. My name is Andrew Cardozo, and I'm president of the Pearson Centre. I want to start by recognizing that the Pearson Centre is headquartered on the traditional lands of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples, and we welcome our speakers and audience who are joining us from across Turtle Island. As you may know, the Pearson Centre is a leading progressive think tank that addresses the challenging economic and social issues of the day. We are proud to say we are perhaps the only think tank which invites representatives from all 5 political parties, top business and labor leaders, civil society leaders, and many other experts. As we like to say, we bring people and ideas together. A special thank you to all our donors and sponsors, especially our sustaining sponsors who include the MAPCO, Ontario's professional employees, the International Association of Firefighters, and Canada's building trades unions, and a special sponsors for this conference who include Baylis Medical Technologies, the Hill Times, and the Canadian Health Coalition. You can also visit our website if you'd like to make a donation and make these and help these sort of sessions happen. The website is thepearsoncentre.ca. Just briefly on the format, we have an hour-long conversation where, following a brief opening thoughts from our 3 co-chairs, the 3 of them will engage with our special guest till about the end of the hour. There will be time for a few questions at the end, so feel free to send in your questions on the question box on your screen. So our webinar today, what is the world coming to? Our special guest is the Honourable Lloyd Axworthy, who has devoted his life's work to academia, politics, and civil society. He is one of the most consequential foreign ministers in Canadian history and continues to be actively involved in the international arena. He is one of Canada's leading voices on global and migration protection as chair of the World Refugee and Migration Council, and he was recently named co-chair of a new Immigration Advisory Council in the province of Manitoba, his home province. To discuss our topic with him are 3 amazing Canadians who have thought much about these big issues, about what the world is coming to, how it affects Canada, and how it affects us in each of our regions. So the 3 co-chairs. Indira Naidoo-Harris is a highly experienced senior journalist and influential former minister in the Ontario government. She is currently the Associate Vice President at the University of Guelph for Diversity and Human Rights. Frank Baylis is Executive Chairman of Baylis Medical Technologies. Frank is a former Member of Parliament, deeply committed to better politics in Ottawa. He is recognized as an innovative and very successful businessman in the medical field in Quebec. And Dave Bulmer is President and CEO of MAPCO, Ontario's professional employees, the 2nd largest professional employees union in Ontario. Dave is widely respected in the labor movement. He heads a union of 15,000 senior executives in and outside the Ontario government, and is also respected widely across the country, especially among his counterparts in other provinces. We will start with short openings from each of the 3 co-chairs, and what I'll do is ask each of you to comment briefly on the areas you're going to be involved in during this conference, and any other thoughts you have, all compiled into about 2 minutes. So I'll start with you, Indira Naidoo-Harris.
Oh, thank you so much, Andrew, and so good to be here with everyone today. I'm really pleased to be here with you for this opening session of our Pearson Centre Conference, The New Challenges and What is the World Coming to? I'm especially excited to be here today for this important conversation with the Honourable Lloyd Axworthy about the troubling events unfolding in the Ukraine and their impact on our future. In the coming weeks, I will be moderating an exciting session with the Honourable Margaret McCain about the new challenges facing Canadian families and the recent federal government's national childcare initiatives. We'll be taking a close look at the initiatives and the impact they will have on the daily lives of Canadians in our future. You know, Margaret McCain has been a strong voice for national childcare and a national childcare plan in Canada for years. And in our session, we're going to take a look at what's been done, the foundation that's being laid for childcare in our country, and we're going to ask, is it enough? What role and responsibilities do the provinces have to play? Who pays? And what will childcare look like in the future as people are trying to sort out this post-pandemic life and hybrid work and remote and online work? So that's something I think that will be very, very interesting for all of us in the coming weeks. As for this conference, the new challenges facing Canadians, well, it's been an extraordinary 2 years for us, navigating the challenges of the global pandemic and serious inequities in our society. And so I'm going to be very interested in taking a look at what the new challenges are, how we're going to meet them as a country, and specifically look at equity-seeking groups and what we are going to be doing to establish that solid foundation for all Canadians to be successful. So those are the things that I'm looking forward to in this conference, Andrew, and again, very excited to be having this conversation with the Honorable Lloyd Axworthy.
Thank you, Indira. I'll ask Dave Bulmer to go next.
Thank you, Andrew. We appreciate the opportunity to be here with our friends from Pearson, with our fellow guests. It's truly an honor to have the opportunity to speak with the Honorable Lloyd Axworthy. In addition to today's event, I'll be taking part in an event next week that ponders the future of conservatism. As someone who represents civil servants, primarily at the provincial level, what a great opportunity to speak to a minister like Mr. Axworthy. And I'm hoping that I can get a couple of questions across to him about his experience. History tends to repeat itself, sadly, unfortunately, as well as some of his impressions on some of the things that have happened in Ontario of late. And of course, with the under normal circumstances, we'd all be in the same place, but the elephant in every room, or every Zoom, I should say, is the pandemic, and I'm interested to hear his experiences with that as well. So again, thank you very much, Andrew, for having us.
Thank you, Dave. And over to you, Frank Baylis.
Well, first of all, Andrew, I'd like to thank you for this great invitation. It's exciting to be able to be here with such a esteemed set of panelists. I don't know how I got squeezed myself in there, but thank you very much for doing that. And also thank you to the Pearson Centre for putting on this excellent event to talk about the challenges facing Canada. We always hear, this is new times, these are challenging times. I was speaking to a gentleman that's touching 99 years old. And he told me, Frank, I ain't seen nothing like this in my 99 years. So I know we all think we live in challenging times, but I believe that this pandemic has really been something unique and special, and really brought to the forefront some of the cracks in our systems, some of the opportunities to fix our systems, and to look at them as a whole right now under this series of talks we're going to have, I think is excellent. Now, to have Mr. Axworthy there, I'm very excited about that, because one of the panels that I'm going to be talking about with my colleague Eleni Bakapanis, another ex-member of Parliament, is the challenges facing democracies. Democracies in danger. Obviously, we can look at Ukraine and see that's staring us right in the face of a nascent country, a new democracy trying to find its way in the world, and a bully trying to crush it because it wants to make its own decisions. And that, I believe that we're living in precarious times right now for democracies, obviously not just in Ukraine, but around the world. And I've seen this flow towards autocracies, and it's got me extremely concerned, because I firmly believe that democracies where many people are participating, where many voices are present, give best solutions. And by gosh, we need a lot of solutions to a lot of the challenging faces our world today. So I'm looking forward to having that, and also hearing the thoughts of the Honourable Mr. Axworthy on that issue of what are these challenges specifically for our democracies.
That's wonderful. Thanks so much, Frank. So what we'll now do is move to our second segment of the session, where you three co-chairs will discuss various issues with Lloyd Axworthy, and I'll turn over to you, Frank, to be the timekeeper among you three, and we look forward to your discussion.
Thank you, Andrew. So we'll start off with yourself, Dave. I'll let you start off with some grilling of our fine guest here.
All right, thanks for the opportunity, Frank. So Lloyd is a Saskatchewan boy and a former Manitoba MVP. No doubt you have very strong ties to the Canadian-Ukrainian community. What are your thoughts on a personal level regarding the Russian invasion? And then as a former Minister of Foreign Affairs, what are your impressions of NATO and Canada's response? Are we doing enough? Could more be done?
Well, thank you, David. Before I answer that very tough and concrete question, let me just indulge in a moment of nostalgia going back, I think, over 10 years when Andrew Cardozo first talked to me about setting up a progressive policy think tank in Canada, which was largely needed. I stand in great admiration for the work that's been done. I think that what we're seeing in this next couple of weeks of discussions really is something that you mentioned, the threat of democracy. Well, one way to offset that threat is to get dialogue, discussion, and ideas out in the public debate. And I think that's something that the Pearson Center does very well. Okay, Ukraine. Let me start with a visceral reaction. Last week, we were all, I'm sure, horrified at the pictures coming in about the massacre, the atrocities going in the small village of Bucha in Ukraine. People being tied, murdered, raped by the total and complete sort of barbarism of the Russian army, and clearly with the indulgence of the Russian president. What was our response? As to your question, Tim, what was the Western response? Well, there was a lot of outrage, and that was good rhetoric. But in concrete terms, the response was, we're going to apply more sanctions to Mr. Putin's daughter and a few of his associates. Now that and about $3 will get you a ride on an Ottawa bus. It simply has there's no appropriate correlation between the degree of extremity that we saw and the response from the West. My point is, let's talk about this kind of sanctions obsession we have right now. We have portrayed this from the outset as the way in which this will alter, change, affect Putin, his decisions, and Russia. It isn't. I would grant, because I was involved in doing sanctions, that over time, Russia will be affected, lack of investment, the lack of consumer goods. But every time we say we're going to put a new sanction on somebody's daughter or some banker, close to $1 billion transfers from Europe to Russia for paying of gas and oil exports. Their economy is not in trouble. The ruble's bouncing back. They now have a current accounts surplus larger than they had before the war started. And Putin, as most dictators have, established the art of controlling his public. There's an incredible, wonderful article by Anne Applebaum, The Atlantic, about 6 months ago, saying we're now in an age where the notion that there can be domestic pressure to moderate the decisions of autocrats is gone. They just control too many of the levers. The Secret Service, the social media, the surveillance that goes on. And they simply are not interested or care about what their public thinks. First, because of control, and secondly, it's not going to threaten their domain. So my question is, when we're talking about a forward look, we have to begin thinking that right now we're sort of well, let's put it in field terms. We had a very quick start, but now we're into the second or third lap, and we're beginning to slow down. And everything goes back to questions of caution. Are we going to provoke Mr. Putin? Can we really afford not to sort of have oil and gas as our primary energy source, we're not thinking, for example, well, how do we replace that oil and gas? How do we replace fossil fuels with something so that we're not? I mean, the Germans made a horrible mistake. I don't, you know, I looked at this pretty carefully. Helmut Schmidt, who was a longtime chancellor, the Germans made a decision to basically put their entire energy dependence on Russia, not diversify, not balance it out. They even, I mean, a lot of environmentalists cheered when they said we're going to get rid of nuclear power, but that took away about 20% of their electrification. So basically, Putin has a stranglehold. And it's not the only European country, the Greeks, the Italian, I mean, they're all faced with that same kind of what I would call Hobson's choice. Anything they do that Putin's going to get mad about, they're concerned that it's going to cut off their supplies. And if they cut off their supplies, there's going to be a domestic uproar because people are not prepared to face the risk of higher inflation and higher gas prices. So we really are in a quandary right now. I mean, we really are in a conundrum about where we go, because I think what we have thought was a sort of a pathway which we could manage the global system no longer exists. Putin has thrown a kind of stink bomb right into the middle of it. And I think as a result, we're falling back on our heels. We're not being prepared to be a little serious. And I'll make one further comment, Dave, that I went back to read I guess what you would call a seminal article called Article X in the 1948 Foreign Affairs magazine, written by sort of the father of containment, George Kennan. And what was his basic view about the Soviet Union at the time? He said, containment means you don't simply sit behind a wall. You make sure that every move is countered by a counter move. Every time they make a move, you push back. In other words, we're not doing that right now. And I know that the only people who are doing it effectively are the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian people. They're the ones who are standing up for the things that we're doing. And of course we're helping. We're sending, various forms of weaponry and things, but certainly not enough to stop the incredible bloodthirsty destruction of a country in front of our eyes. And so I must say, I think you know from reputation, I'm not known as a hawk, and I'm also known as an optimist. I have to say, in both cases, I think we need to have a much stronger sense of how we deal with the so-called sovereignty of countries to commit massacre when they want to their own people or to their next door neighbor. And then secondly, we also have to begin looking at a new toolbox to make sure that there is a response to these kinds of egregious invasions, atrocities, violations, and basically international criminal activity.
Thank you for that, Lloyd. I appreciate your experience from a foreign affairs perspective. I was hoping I could tap into some of your experience from some of your other portfolios more on the domestic stage. And I'm wondering, with the pandemic, what your impression of the federal and provincial responses at a higher or granular level, what your thoughts are.
Well, I mean, let me say first, I get down on my knees every night thinking, thank God I'm not in government anymore, because I'm not sure exactly what I'd be doing. Look, we're on a totally sort of unmarked map. The navigation signals that Deirdre talked about aren't very clear right now. I think the governments have tried to respond, but it's been a little bit of hit and miss. In Canada in particular, because of our federal system, we have a patchwork. There's no symmetry. There's no much uniformity in terms of treatments and areas of how do we work together. That's always been our issue as a federal system. How do we manage that kind of coordination? But I think what I'm beginning to sense now is that we're having this quite incredible perfect storm, or I guess what I call a toxic cocktail: climate, so coronavirus, conflict, corruption. I mean, the four big C's are all beginning to merge into an issue, and we're not sure about how the old manuals and lessons books apply. because conditions have changed. And I think that's really where sessions like this come in. What the Pearson Center is trying to do is to try to kind of generate some new thinking, because what we're basically doing is now sort of almost Pavlovian in response. I want to say this now that I have a small platform. I'm really quite dismayed about how governments, provincial governments, federal governments, other governments, are basically abandoning public health principles and practices. This whole idea that we're into, you figure out what you're going to do about COVID. And in the meantime, we're going to really sort of pull back and rescind any information that will help you make those decisions. You know, it's the old story, you know, that I used to hear when I was in politics, that if you don't want to do something, sort of keep people in the dark and throw manure at them. And I think we're at a stage now where the entire public health system is ready to basically put it into abeyance. And I can't believe it. And public health doctors, officials, ministers are all saying, "What, me? No." I watched the Blue Jay game last night, 40,000 people. I think I counted 3 masks. Well, in the meantime, I read that the positivity rate in Ontario is now close to 18 to 20%. Are you kidding me? So I have to think that while government is becoming more engaged in terms of spending money, I think it's become less engaged in providing effective public policy. And I think that we really, again, need a good kick in the pants, or maybe a more polite word, with a good catalyst, to start really saying that it's not how much you spend, it's how you spend it and what you do with it. And I think that is, right now, I find, is a little bit of a gray fog.
Thank you for that, Lloyd. I appreciate it. As someone representing civil servants, I couldn't agree more with you on the public policy comment that you made. And I'll pass the baton back to Frank now.
Thank you, Dave. That's very good. Very interesting questions on your part. Go ahead, Indira.
Yeah, thank you, Frank. And you know, thank you, Dave. Mr. Axworthy, I'm going to shift the gaze back to the Ukraine and sort of take a broader look at this point. I was particularly interested in when you talked about, you know, touched on the tools in people's boxes and what we have in terms of resources and what we can do. Experts are saying that we're entering a new post-Cold War era, and that this challenging situation in the Ukraine is really putting all kinds of demands on our national institutions. So they're talking about, you know, the United Nations, NATO, you know, the WHO, the UNHCR, even the EU being put to the test. So I want to ask you, what do you think we're learning from all of this as we watch this particular incursion unfold, and as we see how folks are responding? What do you think we're learning about our international bodies and organizations?
I think what we're learning is that we've allowed them to become arthritic over the years, and that there's just not been a lot of investment or energy. But let's talk about the UN. I mean, I was raised in the UN. My graduate work was on the United Nations. I mean, I was a believer and still am. And when I was a foreign minister, as some of you I know, we introduced landmines treaties, the responsibility to protect ideas, all based on the idea that the international community could set some basic standards by which behavior and actions by governments and by individuals in government could be held accountable. And it would mean the International Criminal Court was established in the 90s on the grounds that military, political people making decisions that were aggressive or violations of civilians had to be held accountable and punished. We let that lag. Canada was a very major player in the installation of the ICC. We haven't paid much attention to it recently. We just aren't. And here we are at a time when, I'll tell you what drives me crazy, Indira. I don't watch often, but I turn to some of the American news shows, and I hear some senator or congressman saying, "Oh my God, we'd have to do something about war crimes." Hey, you're the country that refused to join the International Criminal Court. You're a country right now that is refusing to share its intelligence and investigations on war crimes with the ICC. In other words, get your act together and quit pretending that all of a sudden war crimes is something that is ethereal. I mean, it has a long paternity to it. We had institutions, but you had big powers, Russia obviously, China obviously, but the United States in particular, that refused to investigate. They were saying, well, you know, the right wing in the States saying, gosh, we don't want some court going after one of our sergeants in Korea. Well, that they weren't going after. There's a basic principle behind the court called complementarity, and that is that if you're prepared to hold justice on your own people, then there's no role for the court. But in this case, where there was an actual aggression with a series of war crimes attached to it, the use of landmines and other kinds of ordinances designed for civilian destruction, and what we're saying is more sanctions. I go back to my point, as opposed to saying, I would think the one thing that might jog a little bit is if a coalition of countries that Canada should help organize, so brought the indictment to the ICC and basically indicting Putin as a war criminal. And let him live with that. And let the Russians explain that. And at the same time, so that means you're no longer sitting in the Security Council, and then you've abrogated your right to sit in the UN, and that you no longer are members of the Arctic Council, you're no longer members of this organization and others. You are a pariah. Because when you become a war criminal, you're a pariah. But we're hanging back. We're kind of dithering and dancing on this issue. Now, I don't want to sound cavalier, but it bothers me because the tool house that we spent a lot of years building are now the tools are not being used. There's a kind of generation of policymakers that say, "Oh, we have to do something different." And what are we doing? We're falling back on probably the most ineffective tool in the international toolbox to gain accountability behavior, which are sanctions.
I think it's interesting that you talk about a coalition of countries when you talk about war crimes, and I'm going to shift gears a little bit and get into that a little bit more, because I'm interested in the geopolitics of what's going on right now. The Ukraine crisis is opening our eyes for sure to the possibility of future conflicts, because we're looking at a developed country that's being stripped right now by force. And so this conflict, appears to also be engaging or having, possibly forming some bonds between countries like Russia and China, for example. What does this mean then when we talk about the multi-international organizations, but then we also talk about the old system of Western alliances? What should we be looking at in terms of the future? We're now seeing Germany and possibly Japan taking on new military roles. There's questions about how is India going to play into all of this? So I'm curious about what you may have to say about the geopolitics of this and the impact that this could have.
That's an awfully big
it is. I know.
I'm not sure that I can give a clear, coherent answer. What is happening, of course, is that you now have a coterie, I would say a thuggery, of governments in the world who have made a very clear decision that they think that the efforts of post-World War II to set up some form of international system that would hold people accountable, that would set certain norms and standards and rules of behavior, like no aggression across boundaries, protection of people who are vulnerable, all those kinds of things, that it no longer apply to them. I mean, that is probably that's the definition of dictatorship. You think that you're above the law and you're not accountable. And we've allowed that to happen. I'm not saying that we enabled Xi Jinping in China, but I think we let Putin get away with a lot of nonsense. Even when I was in foreign affairs and then afterwards in other various forums, I think there really was a sense, well, if we only can be Mr. Nice Guy with the Russians, then they're going to kind of join the club. There are a lot of Russians who would have liked to join the club, but in the meantime, the old KGB, FSP thugs have taken over because we let it happen, because we weren't simply pushing back. When I say we didn't give them a gilded invitation, but we weren't being prepared to support those forces within other countries. You mentioned the European Union.
Mm-hmm.
It was all based on a basic notion that trade and economic integration would provide for peace and goodwill. In the meantime, along comes Mr. Orban in Hungary, who thumbs his nose daily, who is supporting Putin, who says he doesn't play by any of the rules, and if the basic standard of human rights that the European Union has set out in terms of the rights of women, the rights of LGBTQ people, the rights of dissent, he basically ignores. He's step by step using the Mussolini manual, taken over, used democracy to get office, and now is using the step by step to basically solidify his rule for the rest of his life. And and the European Union is still paying him a European bonus for being Mr. Good Guy. Stop it. Let's cut him out. Say, Orban, to say to the Hungarians, you want Orban? That's your choice. Then you're out of the European Union, and there's no subsidies. There's no migration of freedom for your people to move around. There's no coming to Brussels and shooting your mouth off. Go back into Hungary and live with Orban if that's what you want. My point, I guess, is, and maybe because I'm getting a little cranky as I get a little bit older, it's about time that we started using a little muscle on these dictators and not giving them so much of a free ride.
Frank, if I can just jump in with a quick additional question, if you don't mind. I just wanted to ask you, Mr. Axworthy, the wave of refugees is, creating all kinds of strain on neighboring countries. And you talked a lot about your work with the UN and your studies of them. I want to find out what you think needs to happen now so that we can try to at least minimize, what looks like is going to be a huge humanitarian disaster.
Yeah, just by way of kind of sort of open transparency, I for the last 5 years, I have chaired the World Refugee Migration Council, which is a group of about 30 or 40 people from around the world who have come together to try to provide practical, useful answers on displacement, migration, and refugee issues. We're centered in Ottawa, but we have a membership and a council and I'll just give you an example. We're working very actively with what we call a girl group, providing a digital connection for women and girls in refugee camps and settlements so they have a voice on what's going on. We're working in Central America to try to provide a set of new pathways for migration coming out of Central America. And we're working very actively on corruption issues. We've got one of our members of our council, Senator Odevar, has a bill in the Senate saying that it's not just enough to sort of freeze assets, you have to repurpose them and put them where the people have been victimized by the oligarchs and the kleptocrats and all those other things. And so it's legislation, and we're trying to get the Canadian government to buy into that and use that notion. And we also think it's time for an anti-corruption court internationally. So there's a lot of measures out there. But again, it goes back to your initial question. The United Nations and its leadership is failing, I think, miserably. Franco Grande, who's the head of the United Nations High Commission on Refugees, comes to Canada last week, holds some meetings, has photo ops with the Prime Minister and the Minister of Immigration, and they were moaning, at what I call the Wailing Wall performance. The number of displaced people has now gone from 80 to 84, and it's going to go to 94 by next year. We're going to have a tsunami of people who have just become rootless. Mm-hmm. But as I look for the fine print, what were the solutions? What was he coming to Canada to propose? Because what we know is that right now the international refugee system, as managed by the United Nations, is about 30-40% funded based on the kind of needs that it expresses. It is because what does the UN do? It holds sort of what I would call pledging conferences. It's like holding a little bit of a pledging conference for your daughter's prom concert this spring. The pledges come in, half of them are delivered. So as a result, out of a $6 billion budget, they're only getting 40% of it. That means a lot of refugees are going hungry. A lot of refugees are not being protected. A lot of refugees are getting COVID, and all we're doing is wringing our hands. And that to me is the failure of leadership that's going on right now. And I shouldn't just blame Mr. Grandy. I think he's a very decent man. I've met him a couple of times. But there's no backup. There's nobody at the UNHCR board saying, hey, you want your job, then do something concrete, do something real. Push the membership of the UN to come up with a different financing scheme so that people who are being displaced are going to be properly protected. See, I'm sorry, I'm being pretty negative, aren't I? I'm sorry. You can ask me.
Okay, I'm going to turn it a little on to you personally, Lloyd, here. About 25 years ago, you become Minister of Foreign Affairs. I'm curious, as you stepped into that job, can you tell us a little bit about something that you didn't expect, something that you learned, something that you had to change because you walked in with a certain expectation or a certain way of trying to tackle what you're after, and when you stepped into the world, you realized that things weren't as you expected them to be?
Well, Frank, actually, something I'm going to answer in a different sort of way. I was ready for that job. I had spent, from the time I was a graduate student at Princeton, working on international affairs, to going into civil rights marches, to becoming an MLA in the province, to becoming an activist. I had really been preparing myself for what to expect when and if and how I was given some trust by the people to exercise power on their behalf. And I started out realizing I had to have a purpose to that. It wasn't good enough to be transactional, to react to events and figure out how to fix them. You had to have some reason why you were there. And that by the time Prime Minister Chrétien asked me to become foreign minister, I had spent, particularly in the pre-opposition periods, organizing conferences across Canada on the United Nations, on human rights, on how to deal with aggression. I had become very immersed in about what was happening in Rwanda and Srebrenica, about the kind of genocides that were going on, the kind of way in which governments were abusing their power to basically massacre people. So I'm not saying I had a full sort of forecast of what was going to happen, but what I had, and this is what I think is oftentimes missing in our political people, and dear, you know this from your own experience, you have to have a core set of beliefs on where you think you're going. If you're not doing that, then you're simply going to be responding day by day to what happened this morning and how do I fix it by tonight, or how do I dodge doing it? And you go back to the question period, how do I fudge my answer? So because I don't really, and
so
you fall back.
If I understand, you're saying you arrived with a set of principles that guided you right from the set.
Right.
And do I understand that you don't see that necessarily all the time in our various?
No. Well, it's hard to do because I mean we have increasingly a revolving door system. We've had five ministers in this country since Justin Trudeau came to government. 5 foreign ministers. That means there isn't a lot of sort of continuity or ability to kind of get steeped in the job and understand a little bit what it's going to require. And I don't know. I mean, I think they're all good people and decent people, and they're responding. But you have to look at to go into the union movement. You have to serve an apprenticeship. You have to kind of learn your craft and your trade, and you have to not just learn the skills of it. You have to learn the values of it, about how you do things, and learning about Parliament, learning about what's going on, having a curiosity. Those are all attributes that over time you acquire the more that you're in the process. And I'm not saying everybody has to come in sort of, with a PhD in international relations, but I think over time, if you have an ambition to become a minister, then I think you have to prepare for that, and you have to begin to realize, and also realize that it's not a one-person operation, and that means that over time, I think where I had a real strength, I was in elected politics for 27 years, beginning at the provincial level, but I was able to develop a network of people who we trusted each other, were loyal. They had all kinds of outlooks about the world. And when I got into foreign affairs, I set up our own think tank inside Foreign Affairs to reach out and contact with the civil societies, with the experts, with the academics, and say, okay, we got a problem here in the Middle East. What's your answer to that? Give me some ideas, give me some options, give me some things to think about. So my point is, where I can say that was unexpected, was sort of the fact that there was in the mid 90s, is that there had been a substantial sort of what I would call leavening of people's attitudes towards international activity. We were able to get a landmine treaty in place, and the politics of it.
Was that one of the landmine treaty? Would you say that's one of your biggest accomplishments as a foreign minister?
I think it was one of Canada's biggest accomplishments.
Not just your own personally, but yes.
No, not a bit. No, I mean there was a real partnership. People in the Foreign Affairs Department, we had some of the best sort of public servants. I mean, who were really engaged in that issue. We had civil societies, the Coalition on Banning Landmines, which is international. But we had the Mine Actions Committee in Canada. We now have the Landmine Foundation. People who were really engaged in what they were doing. And then thirdly, we had a lot of people, some in my colleagues, and I in this case, I give credit to the Prime Minister, Grandchip, who basically said, look, as a minister, I'm going to let you make some decisions. It's not going to be centralized. It's not going to be, based upon what I think. You come to me with what you think, and as Gretchen said, if what you do works, I'm going to take the credit. If it doesn't work, then you're out of a job. And he said that laughingly, fortunately. But he was terrific to work with, and he backed me up on all these things: the landmine treaty, the international court, working on small arms, child soldiers. We had a real effort underway, and at the time, I think Angus Reid told me this the other day. I was on a call with him. He said, in 1997, the number one sort of value the Canadians attributed to the government was what we were doing internationally. I'm not sure you'd find that today.
You touched on something there again, on one of the issues that is near and dear to my heart is strengthening our democracy. And you mentioned that Prime Minister Chrétien allowed you to act and behave. You came with a set of skill sets. He put you in a job that you felt prepared for, but then he also let you do your job.
Yes. Yeah, I think that I think you've all raised this issue of how does democracy work. I think we are increasingly shaving away the elements that make democracy work. The political parties, they're now just election machines. They're not the place where people are being given an opportunity to really engage in serious issues about their own concerns and in the region. I think we run national campaigns based on the positives. It's the leadership issue. Is it going to be Mr. Trudeau? Is it going to be Mr. Charest? Is it going to? The reality is that we've basically been innovating a lot of the local root involvement of people over time. I mean, I've had 2 or 3 occasions where national leaders here talk about a movement. Come on, a movement is a mass, but that's not an engagement. That's not a serious investment. That's simply showing up to cheer. And I'm thinking, these are things, and with the advent of social media, I mean, that just becomes worse. So you can have an Elon Musk with 88 million Twitter users, and he is clearly converting that into a power position. And he's got the money to do it, and he has the ambition to do it. And so all of a sudden, what used to provide guardrails, what used to provide sort of balancing acts, political parties, bowling clubs, trade unions, which always were able to provide some kind of counterpoint, I think are increasingly being sidelined in the making of decisions.
That's a topic that's near and dear to my heart, and it worries me because as I look around the world and I see bad decisions, we talk almost of the war in Ukraine as Putin's war, where he's effectively, he has to lie to everybody. He has to shut down all his journalists. He has to lie to his own population. He even has to lie to his own soldiers what he's doing. And that's the danger of one man having too much
That's
power.
right. That's right.
Is there?
And that would be the Achilles heel. That would be the weakness, and ultimately, he's going to be caught. He's being caught out right now. I mean, the Ukrainian are basically showing that his army isn't invincible, and that his ambitions are being thwarted. I'm just really, as I said at the first part of our discussion, I'm just concerned that can they hold the course? Can they stay the course? Because that takes an enormous amount of sacrifice and effort on their part to do it. But they're out there on the front line for the rest of us.
Now, as I wrap up here, if you were back as for a foreign minister today with the expertise that you have and all that, and you find yourself here today with the challenges of not just the war in Ukraine, but these challenges against democracies. You've already mentioned something like you would take a lot heavier hand, would say, a Viktor Orban yeah. Can you just wrap it up like that? Because you've got these challenges with the dictatorships really falling in many countries around the world, Turkey, China, Russia, you name it. What would you be bringing back to the world?
Well, I don't think there's one silver bullet. I mean, I think there's a lot of things that needs to be done. I go back to a point that Indira raised about the inequity. I think our global system has really resulted in horrible disparities, both economically, but socially and politically. I mean, we have a system now of enormous wealth. I mean, the ratio between those on the lowest rung and those on the highest rung is extrapolated by 20 times what it was, say, back in the 50s or 60s. And I think that inequity is really at a core base. So part of it is how do you begin to provide coherence in what you're doing? For example, I think that what I discern a little bit is that actually there's an interesting sort of correlation between what we have to do about the climate crisis and what we have to do about dictatorships, which is one thing is to reduce the reliance upon fossil fuels. And we have to do that with urgency and dispatch, because if we don't do that, the fossil fuel industry is going to continue to support dictators. Where do you think the Middle East sheiks and dictators get their money? Where does Putin get his money? Well, I mean, it's all based upon controlling those kinds of fundamental levers. The thing about a green economy, it can be much more decentralized. It can be people putting solar panels in their fields, or windmills, or providing all kinds of new grids for putting power to work. But to me, one of the threats, I think, to our system is the over-centralization of what's going on. And that's where I think that the democracy, so if I put together the threat to democracy, climate change, and COVID, I think and conflict, I think that there's some common threads that can be pulled together and tied together.
Excellent. I'll pass it back to you now, Andrew. I see you've joined us again.
Well, thank you. We've got a few questions coming in, and Lloyd, I thought I'd put a couple to you, and then I'll ask one of the themes that's come up a lot in your discussion and the questions is polarization. So I'll ask all of you to comment on what your thoughts are about polarization in Canada. But Lloyd, I'll first ask you a couple of questions. One is with regards to Ukraine. And the question was, as I put up real quick, is whether you feel we have done enough in terms of military support to Ukraine, given that, and I'm not aware of this, that Putin has set May the 9th as a deadline for declaring victory.
No, if you want a quick second, no, we haven't. I think there's a lot more that not only needs to be done, but could be done. But let me throw a kind of clanker into the discussion about it. What is probably one of the most advanced military articles that Canada produces? It's a very sophisticated sort of Land Rover type vehicle made in London, Ontario. And who do we sell it to? the Saudis so they can use it in Yemen. I would suggest that we go to the manufacturers and the unions and say, how about if we began sending some of those highly advanced military vehicles to the Ukrainians, so they have a much higher degree of mobility and sophisticated technology to work with. So why are we sitting back on that? What we're saying is, well, we can send some more armor, some more masks, and maybe a few weapons. But to me, I don't think Western countries are really putting their best foot forward. I think we're still hanging on to a lot of stuff that could be used and utilized effectively, and it's not being used.
Yeah, do you think all the countries should be sending more arms into Ukraine, or should we be sending people as well?
Not just arms. I mean, there was an interesting little news piece, I think it was this morning, that the Prime Minister of New Zealand is sending 30 New Zealand soldiers to Poland to work on helping them deal with the refugee issue, to provide field hospitals, provide administration, to provide support in terms of security in the camps and things of that kind. We actually, when I say used to have, we still have in the books a thing called DART, which is under the Defense Department, which is a fully mobile hospital clinic area. It's sitting in mothballs. And why? Because somebody in Treasury Board, I guess, somewhere said it costs too much. Well, come on. Compared to what we're not doing, what would have happened if there was a DART sitting sort of on the border of Ukraine and Poland right now to deal with the wounded and the sick and all the kinds of surgical medical reasons? It would be an enormous contribution. But what's happening is it's still in the books, but and I think there's still some colonel who's in charge, but it hasn't been used for the last 5 or 6 years. There's an example of what I'm talking about, Andrew.
Okay, thanks. What I'll do is just go for a quick round of closing comment then on the question of polarization, primarily in Canada, but anywhere else if you want to talk. I'll start with you, Indira, then Dave, and then Frank, and then Lloyd, last word to you.
Sure.
Indira, go ahead.
Polarization, it is something, frankly, Andrew, that really worries me and that really scares me. I see it happening more and more around the world. My own personal story is that I was born in South Africa under apartheid, and that is a perfect example of polarization. Ultimately, in the end, democracy suffered, and so did civil society. And democracy is built on the notion that we all come together and work together to take care of each other and our needs, as opposed to I'm looking after this group and I'm looking after this group and these are my ideas. And so I think it's one of the biggest threats right now to civil society, and I'm very concerned about it taking a hold in Canada and changing the environment in our country, the national character.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Indira. Dave?
Polarization to me, I have to wonder why we seem to be dehumanizing one another. And Lloyd touched on something that we didn't get into, and that's social media. And I think that's been one of the birthrights to what's happened. And once upon a time, people had to be accountable to one another, and now we have this anonymity, and we have the ability for messages to spread, and we have bots being deployed to amplify messaging, and all too often it's hatred in support of whatever our specific cause might be. And as Indira just said, I think that it's Frank has this coming up later on in one of his workshops. It's a real threat to civil society and to democracy. And the advent of fake news, and where has all of that come? It has come in the last 20 years through the channels of social media. And so I don't know that there's a way to govern that, but there has to be a way for each of us to develop some degree of accountability and responsibility, demand that of each other.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Frank, over to you.
There's no question that we're living in a time of extreme polarization, and we see it even at our political class, where myself, I was in politics, and Indira's been there. And the first question to ask is, before you tell me your idea, tell me which party you are with, so I can decide if I'm even going to listen to you. What is the counterbalance to polarization? It's diversity, equity, inclusion. So we actually have two movements going on here. We have one movement to polarize us. You're black, white, good, bad, yes, no. And the other one, we're saying, no, we're going to be diverse. We're going to not only be diverse, we're going to be inclusive of that diversity, and we're going to be treating each other equally. So on one hand, it can look pretty pessimistic, but on the other hand, it's very optimistic. And I look to always the younger people who are more urbane, more with it, more in tune. And I see so many of them, and they don't want to hear about intolerance. They don't want to hear about negativity. They're not interested in attacking people because of their religion or because of their sexual orientation or their ethnic background. So I do see this polarization, but I also see a strong movement to counter it, which I'm betting on and hoping wins out.
Okay. Thank you, Frank. Over to you, Lloyd, for your last thoughts on this question.
My benediction. I think, let me just say I certainly associate with the answers that we've had from Indira and Dave and Frank. I'll add 2 points to it. I do want to pick up on the social media thing that Dave mentioned. It is a devil's invention in a way. When it first came, we thought it was going to open up for all kinds of new things, and it does. But it's also can be kind of dominated. If you're trying to express a thought in 120 words or less on Twitter or whatever the numbers are, that means that there's not enough time to really think about it. There isn't a sense of being able to have an exchange or a dialogue. And I think there's an incredibly good article by Robert Reich, the former U.S. Secretary of Labor in The Guardian today, about the Elon Musk thing and how billionaires are going to run this world by simply buying social media. The other point I really want to raise is I think we have to be much more careful about our own democracy, because I think we are too many people who are not included in it. I come from Western Canada. I've always had grievances. I've always been slightly polarized, to be honest, as you know that, Andrew. But the reality is that we have a system right now in which it is very difficult to have minority voices heard. And I think that includes a lot of people, not just regionally, but I think socially and culturally. And as a result, I think that we have to be very careful about our electoral system, the role that money plays in it. I think we have to be very careful about who gets to vote and under what rules. And we have to be very careful, as I said earlier, about really restoring a kind of integrity and involvement of our political parties.
Lloyd, yeah, I think many people might say that the issues you've just outlined are more of a problem in the U.S. and not really a problem in Canada.
No,
what do you think?
No. Canadians, in many cases, there's been some studies that shows that a lot of the sort of fanaticism coming in the social media emanates from Canada. And we got a lot of crazy, right-wing, nasty, anti-Semitic characters out there. We saw it being displayed during the convoy, where they took over that whole issue and were able to use the media as an exchange, and they polarized. I mean, this will get me in trouble, but I don't think it was much of a democracy having a bunch of white guys running around wrapping themselves in the Canadian flag and saying they're patriots, when in fact what they were out to do was to basically destroy our democratic system of government. And I think that increasingly our mainstream media are finding it hard to maintain their values of balanced reporting, at the same time put up with a kind of highly targeted effort to kind of propagandize and politicize everything they do. And I think that the thing we have going for us right now is we don't have the same cultural sort of history. We don't have a slavery issue in this country. We have slavery, but it hasn't been done. We're now beginning to pay attention to the indigenous sort of grievance, long-standing, but it doesn't have that horrible kind of twist of white man rule that we have in the United States. And that's where I think, to me, marks a big difference.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. I just, before I find a word of thanks, I just want to remind our audience that we've got a session tomorrow, which will be talking about the new parliamentary precinct, and in part it deals with the issues that have been mentioned about the convoy that occupied Ottawa, and the idea is to come with a new vision about Wellington Street and the parliamentary precinct. That'll be tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. We'll have local MPP, city councillor, and a young woman by the name of Zexi Lee, who, where the entire government structure couldn't do anything, she led a court case and got a court injunction against these guys blowing their horns 24/7. So it's the power of people that can do.
Andrew, that's democracy at work. That's real democracy at work.
Yeah, she's quite amazing. That'll be tomorrow at 7 p.m. In the next 2 weeks, we've got a number of other sessions that'll deal with economic recovery, childcare, pharmacare, politics, and labor. The last session will be with Minister Seamus O'Regan, the Minister of Labor. So thank you very much, all of you, for this wonderful discussion, for starting this conference out so well. Indira Naidu-Harris, Frank Bayless, and Dave Bulmer, look forward to your continuing to co-chair this conference over the next 2.5 weeks. Lloyd Axworthy, thank you for being an early supporter of the Pearson Center, being on the board, one of the founding board members, and you continue to be on the advisory board. But more importantly, thank you for the work you have done in public service and continue to do. It's awfully important in these times of change. So thank you for that, and thank you, everybody.
Good luck,
Bye.
everybody. Nice to be with you. Thank you.